It's time to revisit Project 2025. Welcome back to Stickman Talks, everyone. As you can see, I am Stickman, and today we'll be talking again about Project 2025. Do you all remember that quirky little book? If you don't, here's a brief reminder. Project 2025 is an over 900-page long manifesto of sorts developed by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank based out of Washington, D.C. They describe their mission as, quote, to formulate and promote public policies based on the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense. Keep this in mind throughout the video. Anyways, Project 2025 quickly gained prominence during the 2024 election cycle due to some of its more radical changes to policy and US government structure. Democrats quickly attempted to tie this to Trump himself, claiming that if he were elected, Project 2025 would be his official platform. Trump responded by claiming he knew nothing about Project 2025, with his team saying his official platform was listed on his website as Agenda 47. But where do we stand now? Did Trump lie about his knowledge of Project 2025? Well, I'm not going to answer that directly. That's for you to determine with the information I'm about to present to you. Today, we're going to be examining the policy changes of Trump's second term through the lens of Project 2025 to learn more about where we are as of now and perhaps more importantly, where we might be headed. We're also going to be cross-checking everything against Trump's official agenda, Agenda 47, because that just feels like the right thing to do. Before we get into it, I have to give a huge shout out to the creator of today's main resource, Project2025.Observer. Someone by the name of Rustic Gorilla put this website together, and it streamlined the research for this video a ton. Now, without further ado, let's get right into it. In his presidential debate with Kamala Harris on September 10th, 2024, Trump said, quote,
Number one, I have nothing to do, as you know, and as she knows better than anyone, I have nothing to do with Project 2025. That's out there. I haven't read it. I don't want to read it purposely. I'm not going to read it. This was a group of people that got together. They came up with some ideas, I guess some good, some bad. But it makes no difference. I have nothing to do. Everybody knows I'm an open book. Everybody knows what I'm going to do. Cut taxes very substantially and create a great economy like I did before.
Just a few months after Trump made that statement denying his involvement, he proceeded to promote several people tied to Project 2025 into key positions in his administration. Some had more direct and prominent ties to the project than others. For example, Stephen Miller, a longtime Trump loyalist, is the head of the conservative legal activist group America First Legal, which served as one of Project 2025's advisory organizations. Miller was also featured in videos produced by the Heritage Foundation promoting Project 2025. After winning the election, Trump picked Miller to be his deputy chief of staff. Then there's Russ Vought, who was quite literally one of the top authors of Project 2025. Trump picked him to lead the Office of Management and Budget. There are a few other names in Trump's current administration who have ties to Project 2025 too. For example, Tom Homan, Trump's specially appointed border czar, is listed as an overall contributor to the project. Caroline Leavitt, Trump's current press secretary, is listed in the document as one of Project 2025's instructors who train conservatives on conservative governance best practices. Of course, this could all be one big coincidence. After all, with a group as big as the Heritage Foundation, which has been advising Republican presidencies since the 1980s, there is bound to be some crossover when it comes to who is involved with what. But what about the policy changes inside Project 2025? That could be far more telling. Well, according to Project2025.Observer, there are a total of 313 detailed objectives inside Project 2025. Of those detailed objectives, a total of 98 of them have already been completed in the first 5 or so months of Trump's second term. Another 66 of them are currently in progress, as of recording this video. Of course, these policies vary widely by category and importance. With that in mind, what I'm now going to do is take you through the biggest Project 2025 policy changes by category and then cross-check Trump's official platform of Agenda 47 to see if those same policies were presented there. That should give us a better sense as to whether this is pure coincidence or not. Let's get right into it, beginning with general governance changes that have been enacted. For the purpose of flow, each of these sections is going to start with objectives that have already been completed. It'll then go into objectives that are currently in progress. There will be a section for where we generally may be headed later on in this video. Oh, I'm going to be moving pretty quickly too, so be ready. Let's get into it. First up, let's start by discussing the Department of Justice. Per Project2025.Observer, there were 9 objectives within Project 2025 pertaining to the DOJ. I won't have time to cover all 9 because some are bigger than others, but I will give you the big ones. To begin, Then on page 214 of Project 2025, it calls to quote, rescind damaging guidance by Attorney General Merrick Garland that limits investigators' ability to identify records of unauthorized disclosures of classified information to the media. On April 24th, 2025, the Trump administration did just that by rescinding Biden-era protections for journalists and leak probes. There is no mention of Merrick Garland or rescinding protections for journalists in Trump's official platform, Agenda 47. Moving on, here's an even bigger one. On page 550 of Project 2025, it calls for prohibiting the FBI from, quote, combating the spread of so-called misinformation and disinformation by Americans who are not tied to any plausible criminal activity. Pretty much as soon as Trump got into office, he signed an executive order to restore freedom of speech and end federal censorship. That executive order specifically says, quote, under the guise of combating misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, the federal government infringed on the constitutionally protected speech rights of Americans across the United States in a manner that advanced the government's preferred narrative about significant matters of public debate. Trump's Agenda 47 did call for this, specifically saying, quote, we will ban the federal government from colluding with anyone to censor lawful speech. The Department of Justice also has several objectives from Project 2025 that are currently in progress, such as aiming to prosecute local officials, including district attorneys, that use their discretion not to prosecute a criminal case. Another one is ensuring quote-unquote appropriate steps are taken to obtain cooperation with sanctuary cities and states, and to use, quote, the full force of federal prosecutorial resources to investigate and prosecute all state and local governments, institutions of higher education, corporations, and any other private employers who are engaged in discrimination in violation of constitutional and legal requirements, per page 562 of Project 2025. On that last point specifically, Attorney General Pam Bondi has directed the Justice Department to, quote, investigate, eliminate, and penalize private companies and universities that have quote-unquote illegal diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, according to Forbes. Agenda 47 says nothing about DEI specifically, nor does it call for using federal resources to prosecute state and local governments or other institutions listed in Project 2025. Let's move on from the DOJ, though, to discuss more general changes related to presidential power. On page 45 of Project 2025, the document calls for allowing political appointees the power to personally review and authorize appropriated funding. If you're thinking that sounds like what Elon Musk was doing with Doge, you're correct. There is no mention of doing this anywhere in Agenda 47. Just down the way on page 52, Project 2025 calls for the administration to, quote, replace all essential detailees with staff aligned to the new president's priorities. This happened soon after Trump was sworn in. On January 22, 2025, newly appointed National Security Advisor Mike Waltz sent home dozens of National Security Council officials, with the goal of aligning aides with Trump's America First agenda. There is no mention of this anywhere in Agenda 47, but it's unsurprising given that Trump has previously said he made a mistake by not surrounding himself with loyalists in his first term. One final one I feel should be mentioned before we move into our next section. On page 557, Project 2025 called for preparing a plan to immediately end any policies, investigations, or cases that run contrary to the law or, way more importantly, administration policies. Trump made this really easy for the authors of the project, as on January 20th, he signed an executive order to end the weaponization of the federal government, which alleged that the American people witnessed the Biden administration engage in a systematic campaign against its perceived political opponents. There was no mention of this anywhere in Agenda 47. Also, it's worth quickly noting that there are no Project 2025 objectives related to presidential power that are currently in progress under the Trump administration. All of them have reportedly been completed. With all of that out of the way, let's go over some economic policy changes from Project 2025 that have been enacted or are currently in the works. I'm gonna need to start speeding this video up, otherwise it's gonna get super long. Anyways, let's get this economic section underway. First things first, according to Project 2025.observer, there are only 2 economic goals from Project 2025 that have already been fully completed by the current Trump administration. On pages 832 and 835 of the document respectively, the authors called for reducing regulations on cryptocurrency and to rescind the Security and Exchange Commission's climate disclosure rules, which were adopted in 2024 and required domestic domestic and foreign registrants to include climate-related information in their investment reports. These never actually went into effect because of various legal challenges, but the Trump administration officially pulled back on them anyway on March 27, 2025. As for reducing regulations on cryptocurrency, Trump told prosecutors in early April to ease up on enforcement of rules surrounding crypto. Granted, that technically doesn't mean anything has been completed, but it's still worth noting. Also, neither of these were mentioned anywhere in Agenda 47. However, there are also multiple economic objectives from Project 2025 that are currently in progress. The first is one that drew quite a few headlines when it was first announced. On page 839 of Project 2025, the authors say that Congress should abolish the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. You may remember that a few months ago this started to become reality, except it wasn't at the hands of Congress, but at the hands of Elon Musk and Doge. Musk called to abolish the agency way back in November, and while it isn't completely gone, the vast majority of staff has been laid off. Once again, no specific mention of doing any of this in Agenda 47. Perhaps even more interesting than that, though, is Project 2025's mention of tariffs. Obviously, tariffs under the Trump administration have been the subject of quite a lot of debate, and Project 2025 actually dives into the US trade deficit pretty extensively. On page 771, it even suggests that one way Trump could create a list of countries to negotiate new trade deals with first would be to, quote, choose those countries that have relatively large trade deficits with the US and apply relatively high tariffs. This is somewhat similar to the strategy that the current Trump administration has implemented, although one could argue that they went even more broad with their tariffs. It's also worth noting, though, that suggestions of tariffs do appear in Agenda 47, with the document stating, quote, Republicans will support baseline tariffs on foreign-made goods, pass the Trump Reciprocal Trade Act, and respond to unfair trading practices. As tariffs on foreign producers go up, taxes on American workers, families, and businesses can come down. What else is there in Project 2025, though? Well, some of the less significant economic objectives currently in progress include repealing the Corporate Transparency Act, which required businesses to report certain information about their owners to the Treasury Department. On March 2nd, 2025, though, the Treasury Department announced in a press release that they would no longer be enforcing the act with respect to domestic activity. It still seems to be in place for foreign businesses. There's no mention of doing this in Agenda 47. Moving on from the larger economy to more general labor law changes, let's talk about equal opportunity employment for a minute. On page 584 of Project 2025, the authors call for the rescinding of Executive Order 11246, which was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson way back in 1965 and prohibited discrimination in employment by federal contractors and subcontractors on the basis of sex, race, gender, religion. You get the idea. On January 24, 2025, Trump rescinded this executive order, which effectively ended the requirement for federal contractors to have affirmative action programs. However, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and other anti-discrimination laws are still in place. Neither Project 2025 or Agenda 47 calls for the reversal of any civil rights era laws. With that in mind, let's now move into the next section of the video and discuss Project 2025's immigration objectives. No surprise here, this section is going to be a doozy. According to Project 2025.observer, there have already been 11 immigration-related objectives from Project 2025 that have been fully completed. Let's run through the biggest ones, then talk about what's still in progress. First things first, Project 2025 calls to authorize both state and local law enforcement to take immigration actions on page 150 of the document. On April 18th, CBS News reported that partnerships between Immigrations and Customs Enforcement and local law enforcement have more than tripled since Trump began his second term. Agenda 47 does call for this as well, though, writing, quote, we will start by prioritizing the most dangerous criminals and working with local police. Up next, on page 140 of Project 2025, the authors write, quote, a single nationwide detention standard should be codified that prevents individual states from mandating that federal government agencies adhere to widely expansive and ever-changing sets of standards. Such standards should allow the flexibility to use large numbers of temporary facilities such as tents. The Trump administration does seem to be making this a reality. According to ProPublica, quote, in Trump's second term in office, the government is poised to spend tens of billions of dollars on immigration detention, including unprecedented plans to hold immigrants arrested in the US in massive tent camps on military bases. One recently published request for contract proposals said the Department of Homeland Security could spend up to $45 billion over the next several years on immigration detention. The whole tent thing is highly specific, so unsurprisingly, there's no real mention of it in Agenda 47, but the similarity between what Project 2025 calls for and what the Trump admin is doing felt noteworthy. Moving on though, as we've probably all heard by now, Trump declared a national emergency at the southern border via an executive order in one of his first immigration-related moves after he re-entered office. In this executive order, it not only directed the military to assist in completing the border wall, but also deployed both active duty personnel and National Guardsmen to the border to secure it. This was actually called for in Project 2025 in two separate spots, once on page 166 and once on page 555. While Agenda 47 does say Trump would complete the border wall, it does not say he would deploy military personnel to do so. However, Agenda 47 does also call on mobilizing military personnel to, quote, crack down hard on the cartels that traffic drugs and people into our country. It's vague, but can certainly be interpreted as a call to send troops to the southern border to generally push back against illegal immigration. We're making good progress here, so let's keep going. On page 141 of Project 2025, the authors specifically argue that ICE should be required to take custody of any illegal immigrants who have any record of felonies or other crimes that are considered a national security or public safety threat under current law. Those include other crimes of violence, DUIs, and previous removals from the United States. In an executive order signed on January 20th by President Trump titled Securing Our Borders, it calls for detaining illegal immigrants who are apprehended on suspicion of violating federal or state law until such time as they are removed from the United States. The wording there is pretty similar to what is in Project 2025, and there's no specific mention of this in Agenda 47, but it's not very surprising given Trump's track record on immigration. One final completed objective before we move to the ones that are still in progress. On page 148, Project 2025 claimed that the standard for a credible fear of persecution for asylum should be raised. Interestingly, Trump actually took it further than this, as in a separate executive order he signed on his first day back in office, Trump shut down nearly all asylum claims under the explanation that they were protecting the states from invasion. There is no mention of asylum or shutting down asylum claims in Agenda 47. Okay, time to get into the biggest immigration objectives that are still in progress. On page 149 of Project 2025, the authors call for the administration to reinstate the Remain in Mexico program, which required asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while awaiting their U.S. court proceedings. Trump actually signed an executive order to reinstate this when he first got back in office, but it's currently blocked by a court order. This was blatantly called for in Agenda 47 as well. Project 2025 also calls to suspend all visas from countries that do not accept the return of immigrants deported from the United States. Trump announced this to be the case in the executive order I previously mentioned about protecting the American people from invasion. There is no mention of specifically doing this in Agenda 47. On page 567 of Project 2025, the authors call for ensuring that quote-unquote appropriate steps are taken to obtain cooperation with sanctuary cities and states. The Trump administration has made this a reality as well, as the Justice Department issued a memo on February 5th, 2025 stating that quote, sanctuary jurisdictions should not receive access to federal grants administered by the Department of Justice. Agenda 47 did directly call for this, as there are a few sentences in a document dedicated to stopping sanctuary cities, and it specifically said Republicans would cut federal funding to sanctuary jurisdictions. Finally, to wrap up this section, I want to shift gears a bit and focus on a form of legal immigration, international student visas. On page 141 of Project 2025, the authors write, quote, ICE should end its current cozy deference to educational institutions and remove security risks from the program. This requires working with the Department of State to eliminate or significantly reduce the number of visas issued to foreign students from enemy nations. The Trump administration really ramped this up recently, as Secretary of State Marco Rubio just announced on May 28, 2025 that the US government would soon be revoking visas of Chinese students. Rubio says that includes those with connections to the Chinese Communist Party and those studying in critical fields, though as of now it's unclear how broad the scope of revocation will be. Agenda 47 does call for revoking visas of foreign nationals who, quote, support terrorism and jihadism, which is related to the pro-Palestine protests we saw on college campuses last year, but does not say anything about revoking international student visas specifically. With all of that out of the way, let's move on to talk about social policy. Social policy is obviously a pretty broad topic, so in order to make this easier on all of us, I'm going to be focusing on a few specific areas: LGBTQ+ rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and reproductive health. Let's begin with LGBTQ+ rights, as there are several Project 2025 objectives related to this that have already been completed. The first one I'd like to touch on is pretty specific. On pages 4 and 5 of Project 2025, the authors call for the removal of specific terms from federal rules, contracts, grants, and other documents. Those terms included sexual orientation orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity and inclusion, gender, gender equality, gender equity, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, and reproductive rights. On January 31st, 2025, the Associated Press reported that health data and other website pages that included terms about or related to gender ideology and DEI had been removed from government websites. When he was asked about this, Trump said he didn't know anything about it, but that he would endorse such a move. Up next, let's do a few quickfire updates. Project 2025 calls for multiple changes to language surrounding gender, such as issuing rules and guidance that sex is properly understood as a fixed biological fact, abandoning the redefinition of sex to sexual orientation and gender identity in Title IX, and rescinding Biden-era guidance that added a non-binary option in civil rights data collected from schools. All three of these were accomplished by Trump on his first day back in office via an executive order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. Before moving on to talk about DEI, we need to talk about what the Department of Defense has done recently. In early May 2025, the Department of Defense announced that transgender individuals were no longer allowed to serve in the military. They also announced that public taxpayer money would no longer be used to fund gender reassignment surgeries. Project 2025 called for both of these changes to be made. Agenda 47 says that Republicans would end the use of public tax dollars for gender reassignment surgery, but it does not say anything about banning transgender individuals from the military. Anyways, let's shift to policy changes that have impacted DEI. 5 DEI-related objectives from Project 2025 have already been completed by the current Trump administration, including closing the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, prohibiting the flying of pride flags and Black Lives Matter flags at U.S. embassies, and getting rid of the DEI offices in the Defense Department and military. There are also a few DEI-related objectives from Project 2025 that are currently in progress. On page 48 of Project 2025, the document calls for cutting off government contracts to entities that enforce a quote-unquote woke agenda. Trump tried to do something like this via an executive order right after he got into office again, but it's currently blocked by a court order. Meanwhile, on page 562 of Project 2025, the authors write, quote, "The Civil Rights Division should spend its first year under the next administration using the full force of federal prosecutorial resources to investigate and prosecute all state and local governments, institutions of higher education, corporations, and any other private employers who are engaged in discrimination in violation of constitutional and legal requirements." Trump's Attorney General Pam Bondi directed the Department of Justice to investigate and penalize private companies and universities that are allegedly in violation of these rules, but their actions are also partially blocked by a court order currently. There is no specific mention of doing any of this in Agenda 47. Finally, let's move to talking about reproductive health. 8 Project 2025 objectives related to reproductive health and reproductive rights have been completed already, but some are bigger news than others. For example, Project 2025 calls for eliminating quote-unquote politically motivated prosecutions for those who violate the FACE Act. For those of you who don't know, the Freedom of Accesses to Clinic Entrances Act, also known as the FACE Act, was passed in 1994 and prohibits the use of force, threats, or physical obstruction to interfere with people seeking or providing reproductive health services. As of January 24th, 2025, the Justice Department is now limiting enforcement of the FACE Act. There is no mention of the FACE Act in Agenda 47 at all. Continuing on, Project 2025 also calls for enforcing the Hyde Amendment, which bans any federal funds from being used for abortions or abortion counseling, and to prohibit abortion travel funding. The Trump administration accomplished both of these goals on January 24th, 2025 and January 31st, 2025, respectively. The Hyde Amendment is not mentioned in Agenda 47, nor is prohibiting abortion travel funding. I unfortunately can't cover everything under the social policy umbrella, as I'm sure you figured out by now given how I've treated some of the other sections of this video. So now feels like a good time to remind you to check out my sources for more information, or wait until the end of this video if you want. With that in mind, let's transition into talking about Project 2025 objectives related to foreign policy. This will be the final section of today's video that covers Project 2025 objectives that have been completed or are still in progress, and it'll actually be fairly short compared to the other ones. Let's jump in. First, let's talk about USAID, or more specifically, cutting the budget of USAID. Project 2025 calls to do this on page 254 of the document, and by March 10th, 2025, Marco Rubio announced that 83% of US foreign aid contracts were being canceled. Granted, that's not the entire budget, but it's still a massive portion of USAID. There is no mention of cutting USAID's budget or USAID in general in Agenda 47. Additionally, Project 2025 calls for specific USAID contracts to be cut and the prioritization of aid to certain faith-based organizations. For example, on page 257, the document called for rescinding USAID policies that help countries phase out fossil fuels. On page 265, it calls specifically for faith-based organizations to be prioritized for USAID funding in a section titled Increasing USAID Collaboration with Faith-Based Organizations. The Trump administration accomplished both of these goals, with numerous climate-related USAID projects being cut on March 4th, 2025, and reports claiming that groups like evangelical Christian organization Samaritan's Purse dodged USAID cuts on February 4th, 2025. Once again, neither of these changes are called for in Agenda 47. Shifting gears a bit, Project 2025 also calls for the U.S. withdrawal from multiple worldwide organizations, including withdrawing funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, withdrawing funding from the World Health Organization, and withdrawing entirely from the United Nations Human Rights Council. You can probably tell where I'm going with this. All three of these objectives have been accomplished by the Trump administration, and none of them are mentioned anywhere in Agenda 47. In terms of objectives that are still in progress, there are two that I like to touch on specifically. The first relates to withdrawing from organizations, as Project 2025 also calls for U.S. withdrawal from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, also known as UNESCO. The Trump White House announced they'd be doing this in an executive order on February 4th, 2025, but it has not been fully carried out yet. Finally, shifting gears yet again, page 120 of Project 2025 calls for changes to U.S. Cybercom, which is short for U.S. Cyber Command. U.S. Cybercom was established by the Department of Defense to strengthen DoD cyberspace capabilities and enhance U.S. cyber expertise. Project 2025 says that reform to U.S. Cybercom is needed, specifically calling to quote, end U.S. Cybercom's participation in federal efforts to fortify U.S. elections to eliminate the perception that DoD is engaging in partisan politics. You may be wondering how this falls under the foreign affairs category. Well, that's because U.S. Cybercom works to prevent foreign countries from getting involved in U.S. elections. By February 28, 2025, Trump's Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was telling U.S. Cybercom to stand down from any planning involving Russia. According to the Record Media, the full scope of Hegseth's directive and why he told them to do this remains unclear. There is no mention of doing this in Agenda 47. And now we have finally reached the point where we can do just a little bit of speculation as to where things may be headed in the United States. Let's get into it. By this point, you've probably noticed that there are quite a few similarities between Project 2025 and what the second Trump administration has done so far. But does that mean that everything from Project 2025 will go into effect? Probably not. According to Project 2025.observer, there are 149 objectives from Project 2025 that have not even been started by the current Trump administration, and it's very possible that some of these will never even begin. Yes, a lot has been done already, some of which was actually promised in Trump's official platform, but that doesn't guarantee the Trump administration is going to push absolutely everything from Project 2025. It's also worth noting that the courts still have power here too. As you probably noticed, there are a few objectives that I mentioned that are currently considered in progress, but they're currently fully or partially blocked by a court order. The Trump administration can threaten judges all they want, but that isn't going to stop them from putting court orders in place to block moves they deem unconstitutional. Even though it may not seem like it sometimes, there are still roadblocks for the Trump administration in place here. There are still rules they have to follow. Even the Supreme Court has ruled against Trump recently, even though it is technically a conservative majority. Project 2025 is an extremely detailed document. If every single objective from it were to be completed, the United States would have an extremely different government than the one it has now. We would see changes made, many of them significant, to the vast majority of departments that currently exist. It would impact unions, trade, taxes, Medicaid and Medicare, student loans, housing, the police, and so much more that I didn't even get close to covering in this video. But there is no guarantee that will all happen, as the safeguards currently in place should remain there for long enough to prevent it. With that in mind, let's finally wrap things up. I've already mentioned it a few times in this video, but there was no way I could cover everything from Project 2025 because I didn't want this video to be 3 hours long. If you're interested in learning more about anything I talked about today, please feel free to check out my sources in the description down below. I'd highly recommend doing so if you have the time, especially Project2025.observer, because once again, that website was insanely helpful for making this video. At the beginning of this video, and in the title itself, I asked the question, did Trump lie about his knowledge of Project 2025? Like I said, I'm not going to answer that for for you. That's for you to determine based on the facts I've provided. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments down below though. If you've made it this far, then congratulations, you've successfully sat through the longest video in this channel's history. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please feel free to like and subscribe. More videos coming soon. By the way, if anyone can tell me how many times I said Project 2025 or Agenda 47 in this video, I would really appreciate that because it felt like I was going insane with the script. Thank you. Oh, and one more thing, we hit 20,000 subscribers on the channel a couple weeks ago. That is an insane number. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the support. Hope to see you all again in my next video. Take care.